How many of you remember my string? This is the original string I began with 13, 14 years ago. Actually, someone gave me this string, and it's the kind of string they use for laying bricks so that they get a nice plumb line, you know. And it's 30 feet long, and the way I cut the string was so that 1 foot would represent 200 years. 6,000 years, you know, into a foot. And so usually when I would conduct a seminar, many of you remember, I'd always tie it to one of my speaker stands so I could drag this string out and you could see 6,000 years of time strung out. And I would go through the time, you know, and I would make some points about timing, how that when you get the timing of this all set up, if you move this end, guess what happens to this end? Time is locked in, locked down. And by moving it around, if you yank on one end of the string, the other end goes with it. And so I took this string representing the length of time, and I used I put this mark right here. I had a clothespin that I would hang right here. You remember that? And that clothespin represented the flood. This is how much time there was before the flood. And again, I made the point is that if you move the date of the flood around, you move all other dates with it. If you slide it back and forth, because time is a fixed commodity. Then we come down some more string, looking for the next clothespin, and this was the time of Christ. Remember that? I was showing how that from the very beginning, God foreknew, God planned, God predestined a destiny, a timing. And that's how He can give a prophecy like 70 weeks in advance, because He pre-decrees things to happen. He does not pre-decree people to be saved or lost. That's our choice. But He does pre-decree events. God never created a person to be destroyed. Not one. He created and gave life to every child, hoping that every child would choose life. Felix?
Can I ask you a question? All of this stuff?
You can't explain it. Because their supposition is wrong in the first place. The primitive Baptists believe just what you have expressed. Primitive Baptists teach that God has predetermined who will be saved and who will be lost. And they teach then that there's really no need to share the gospel. There's no need to do evangelizing. There's no need, because it's already predetermined. No matter what you do, no matter what you say, God has already decided who's going to be saved and who's going to be lost. John 3:16 blows that right out of the water. For whosoever believes in Him shall not perish but have everlasting life. You see, the problem ultimately is this. People, if we improperly define certain terms, we'll end up with conclusions that are nonsense. There's an important difference between foreknowledge and predestination. Foreknowledge is knowing the future. Predestination is pre-decreeing events to occur in the future. You have a baby. Foreknowledge says this baby is going to dirty his diaper. But you don't predestine it. You don't pre-decree. It'll happen. You know it's going to happen. You just don't know when. God knows not only that it's going to happen, but in His foreknowledge, He knows when. In the last 3 issues of Daystar, I have dealt very thoroughly with this question because I'm dealing with the study of the seven seals. And the story of the seven seals is the story in Revelation that wonderfully explains this whole matter between God's foreknowledge and what He pre-decrees. And I hope that you'll look at those issues and review them because of the book that's sealed up from the creation of the world. Anyway, so the timeline goes on down, excuse me, and we come to 1844, and we come down to the very end, and we're living at the very last quarter inch or 3/16 of an inch of time. And I use this, I say, this is John 3/16. That's where we are. And since I started this, I ought to shorten it a bit, don't you think, Norm? I mean, it's been more than 10 years since so we might, have to change our text or something. But time, God's timing is incredible. I'm going to show you a little something this morning. I've got two things to show you in this segment, and I want to impress upon you how wonderful Jesus really is about keeping vigil. Do you remember when in the Monday morning, I pointed out how that the children of Israel were to observe Passover because to the very day, at the right time, God had kept vigil. And He delivers them right on time. The first thing I want to show you, let me go to the overhead and explain two things. Here's the sun, here's the earth, here's the moon. Oh, I need to zoom out a little bit, okay? There we go. And a new moon occurs precisely at conjunction. Oops. There's the moon. Conjunction occurs when you have the alignment of three objects. That is a new moon. And a new moon only lasts for a split second. The moon is moving, the earth is moving, sun's standing still now. Sun's been standing still for about 500 years. That's when, Copernicus figured it out. But because of the movement of the earth and the movement of the moon, new moon occurs on a very precise split second, and that alignment occurs. A new moon, because the sun is behind the moon, we can't see it. It is not visible to the naked eye. And when the shadow of the moon falls on the earth, that's known as an eclipse, a lunar eclipse. The moon is elliptical, and as it goes around the earth, it doesn't go around, our earth is tilted. So the orbit of the moon, its shadow is sometimes above the earth, its shadow is sometimes below the earth, and sometimes it's on the earth, depending on where we are with respect to the sun. But a new moon happens with precision every 29 days, 29.53 days. Okay. The ancients, in order to know the beginning of the month, had to calculate the time of the new moon. And the day or night upon which the new moon occurred gets called Nisan 1. So if a new moon is going to occur at, let's say, 2 a.m., and in God's calendar, the evening and the morning are one day. So let's say we're talking if a new moon occurs on Monday at 2 a.m. in the morning, then Nisan 1 occurs on Monday at the time of sundown. If the new moon occurred on Monday at 4 in the afternoon, Monday is still New Year's Day. Let me draw that picture for you. Here's the nighttime, here's the morning time. Here's the daylight, here's the night. And let's say this day is Monday. If the new moon occurs right here, this is still the first day of the month. If the new moon occurs right here, this is still the first day of the month. If the new moon were to occur right at sundown, then it becomes a decision which the priest would make, the high priest would make, as to which day would be the first day of the month. And God required Israel to observe the feast of the new moon. How you like 12 feasts every year? By having a feast and calling a convocation, the establishment of time and the monthly cycle is perpetual. That's what it's for. Everybody knows, everybody keeps time because of a mandatory feast. You are required to go to a party. Oh, it's killing me. I just hate going to parties. But this is the way God kept His people, in synchrony with His plans. God gave a series of feasts that were required at special times. And no other calendar is adequate to determine when these feasts should occur except God's calendar, which uses the sun and the moon and the day and the weekly cycle. No other calendar can meet the requirements of God's feasts. It's kind of amazing. Well, when God called Israel out of Egypt, He took these heathen, and that's basically what they were according to Ezekiel chapter 22. The Israelites were heathen. They had lost the knowledge of God to a great extent. They were worshiping idols. They were really bad people. You can read this in Ezekiel 22. When He came to deliver them out, God is going to give them a new calendar. And this is where the Jubilee calendar starts. And He establishes the first month of the first year and so forth. Now, let me show you something. The new moon is totally dark. And that's represented by a moon that's just totally dark. A full moon is a moon that's totally bright, which happens halfway through the cycle. And the cycle is 29 and a half days in length. So notice, if we go 29 days and the half comes to an end at 4 p.m. on a Monday, we actually start a new day, a new month on that Monday, because the new moon occurred at 4 p.m. on Monday. That would be Nisan 1. The Canaanites and the Babylonians were great astronomers. They started their month slightly different than God's synchrony, and as you would expect. Nobody likes the way God does things. And so the Babylonians, they would wait. See, you have a totally black moon, totally dark moon for a new moon. Then they would wait until the first crescent of a new moon could be seen. in order to start their month. In other words, they waited until they could visibly see the first little slice of the moon, and that would be day one. That's a problem. Question was, what if it's cloudy and raining? That's a slight problem. They would, yeah, right, Pete. They didn't fly up above, no. And they didn't run a periscope up through the clouds. What they did is that they waited. And they would wait for a period of, because you can calculate the new moon, they could calculate pretty close to first crescent too. And if it was an inclement week and they couldn't see, they knew that it would occur within a period of over 3 days. And the priest would choose one, declare first month, and then if they were in error, the error was simply corrected with the next moon. That's the neat thing about an observable calendar like this, is that if you do make a mistake, it's cleared up in the next month. Everybody with me so far? All right. The time and difference between a new moon and the first crescent can be a minimum of 16 hours or a maximum of about 40 hours. This means and that if you're following God's calendar, day 1 for Nisan 1 would be about 2 days earlier than Nisan 1 if you were using the new moon or the first crescent method. See, here are two methods. And depending on which method you use, your Nisan 1 will be about a day or two apart. You understand that? Ken? Okay. Johnny? When I see all these brows kind of furrowed, you know, thinking hard. Now the reason that I bring this up is because there's a very interesting thing that happens. During the Babylonian captivity, the Jews abandoned, and maybe even prior to the Babylonian captivity, there are no records to confirm this, but for sure within the Babylonian captivity there are records. The Jews abandoned God's synchrony of time in some areas in order to adopt and adapt the Babylonian method. You see, the Babylonian Empire is the first world empire that is picked up in Bible prophecy. The Egyptians and the Assyrians, they had their empires, but Israel is out here sort of in the promised land between the two great nations. And when Nebuchadnezzar finally conquers this whole region, the problem of calendation becomes a real issue. How would you like to have a calendar, for example, where your January 13 is 3 days different than the Chinese January 13? And you are in the business of exporting goods to China. How would you like to deal with that? And they're talking January 13, you're talking January 13, but you're not talking the same day. You understand the problem? 3 days difference, 2 days difference, it's a nightmare. So what happened in ancient times, the Babylonians imposed the royal clock on everybody that was under their dominion. And the Jews accepted the royal clock because all businesses and all transactions had to be dated. And in fact, we find this is very prevalent in ancient times. Things were sometimes dated by 2 or even 3 calendars because there is no universal accepted time, no universal time. So the time of the Medes and the time of the Persians and the time of the Babylonians, the time of the Jews are different. Well, at the time of Christ, because some Jews followed the Babylonian method and some Jews followed God's synchrony for the new month, Passover would occur twice. Passover would occur, the conservatives would observe new moon. The leadership in the national Passover was based on the Babylonian clock, 2 days later. This is a well-known historical fact. I'm not making it up. Let's see here. I have a paper. I wanted to see if I could pull this out real quick for you. I have it here on the computer, but it would be too small for you to read. Yes, here we go. Here it is. I want to read just a couple of statements. This is an article that's on the website. You can download it if you care to read it later on. It's in the year 2000 Daystar list, this article. The chronology of Jesus during Crucifixion Week has been a matter of intrigue for centuries. A harmonious resolution of this subject is quite simple once the reader understands the synchrony of 4 time periods. First, the creation calendar defines the commencement of a day from evening to evening. Thus, Sunday evening precedes Sunday morning. Okay? Genesis 1. Second, the Roman calendar defines the commencement of a day at midnight. Everybody acquainted with that one? And the result is that Wednesday night and Thursday morning share the same darkness, but midnight splits the night into 2 dates. Thank you, Romans. Third, the creation calendar defines the commencement of a month with a new moon. And I've given references in the Scripture in 1 Samuel 20 and Numbers 28 are both very good, where God simply says new moon. And fourth, the ancient Babylonian calendar defines the commencement of a month with the sighting of the first crescent of a new moon. After the Babylonian exile, the Jews were divided on the observance of Passover. Some Jews insisted on following creation's calendar. That is, a new month begins on the day of the new moon. Jewish leaders, however, insisted on using the Babylonian method for determining the first day of each month. We want to see. They waited until the first crescent of the new moon was sighted before declaring the commencement of a new month. Because the conjunction of a new moon and the sighting of the first crescent of a new moon are 16 to 40 hours apart, the celebration of 2 Passovers in Israel was not uncommon. For years after the resurrection of Christ, now listen carefully to this. This is an argument that developed among early Christians and was finally resolved by Constantine. Constantine just nailed this right down. But I want you to listen to the story. For years after the resurrection of Christ, for about 300 years, Christians argued when Easter should be observed. Some Christians wanted to observe Easter on Nisan 16, the actual date that Jesus arose. Those in Rome, though, wanted to observe Easter on Sunday, the day that followed Passover, to observe the actual day, not date, of Christ's resurrection. Back and forth. They argued for 300 years on this. This is all in church history. You can find it quite easily if you just look up the Easter argument. This controversy raged for many years. See, the Romans wanted to observe Sunday anyway. Sunday observance had come to Rome about 65, 67 BC, and the great god of Myrtha was the Roman sun goddess. And Sunday was a day of observance and exaltation in Rome about 100 years before Christianity gets there. Because early Christians in Rome were severely persecuted, and because the Romans couldn't tell a Christian from a Jew, they all looked alike. The early Christians in Rome said, hey, I don't want any of this Jewish baggage. And so the observance of Sunday in Rome became prevalent among Christians. Well, finally, Constantine brought this controversy to an end by disconnecting the arrival of Easter with the arrival of Passover. We'll get rid of the Jewish connection. To defend his position, he contemptuously referred to the practice of the Jews observing 2 Passovers as evidence that one should not trust their calculations for determining the arrival of Easter. He's using this controversy right here. Some Jews are observing the new moon. Some Jews are observing the first crescent. And because they can't figure out which is which and they observe 2 Passovers, how can you trust them on which Passover is right? You see his argument. I want to read you what he wrote. This is what Constantine wrote. They, the Jews, do not possess the truth in this Easter question. For in their blindness and repugnance to all improvement, they frequently celebrate 2 Passovers in the same year. This is historical proof of this process. External to the Bible. This is just secular history. The presence, though, of 2 Passovers explains a very interesting mystery, how Jesus could eat the Passover with his disciples on Nisan 15 and then die on the cross at the other Passover on Nisan 15. Clever, huh? It's been a mystery to scholars for years. On what authority and upon what grounds did the creator of the Passover himself, the one who established the dating of the Passover, the one who laid down the law about the observance of Passover, how did he himself transcend and rise above the law to keep it at a time other than its appointed time? Well, the answer is Jesus and his disciples observed Passover at the correct time. He was murdered at the wrong Passover by the wrong people. Have you ever wondered about that? I have a whole paper on this, and then I plot out and show that the whole Passion Week, and it's in the Daystar year 2000 on the internet, and you ought to get download a copy of it and read it. It's really an interesting thing. And when I came across this in my study and I put it all together, I learned several neat things, really sweet. The only point that I'm trying to make, though, is that when the Creator himself is on the earth, he is showing and confirming that the synchrony of what he established is intact. And you will be delighted to hear this. It's the old Ginsu knife commercial. But wait, there's more. You'll be delighted to hear this. That when we go to the U.S. Naval Observatory, and they have carefully calculated all of the times of the sun and the moon and the new moons and the equinoxes during the range of years that Christ was upon earth, a very interesting fact surfaces. The death of Jesus astronomically, the death of Jesus right on time, occurs in AD 30. It will not happen, cannot happen at any other year than AD 30. The sun and the moon, the 2 witnesses in the heavens, are not in the right places at any other time during the 7 years. Again, proving the synchrony of the entire calendar, because this great week is synchronized on the death, the middle of the week of Jesus. Some people say Jesus was murdered, crucified in AD 31. That won't work. AD 33 won't work. AD 30 is the only year in which the harmony of all the pieces and the observance of Passover by Jesus and his disciples, it's the only year this will all work. Well, this changes a lot of things for some of us because the ministry of Christ upon earth is no longer 3.5 years. How about that? Jesus is baptized in the fall of 27. In the fall of 27, so there's 6 months. 12 months of 28. 12 months of 29. And 40 days in AD 30. Actually, 40 days after his crucifixion, so the total will be 55 days. The ministry of Christ turns out to be 24, 28, right at 30 months. The entire calendar aligns, organizes, the sun and the moon and the stars confirm it. I'm telling you the synchrony of the way God does things. Whether we're talking about 1,260 years, whether we're talking about 70 weeks, whether we're talking about 70 years in captivity, the whole of God's timing is just impeccable. I keep jumping up and down on this, like a little kid, I know. But I'm trying to impress you how neat that God, from Jesus, the Creator, from the very beginning, when He started this whole thing, He knew that sin was coming. And He says, I'm going to decide right now, we're going to deal with this whole sin problem in 7,000 years. I'm going to give these people that will live on here a clue about my plans. I'm going to use the weekly cycle, a template of 7. And my Sabbath, to teach them and to show them and to explain things, because I won't be able to talk to them directly. When was the last time you met with Jesus and He talked directly? So He's given us these patterns, and as we look behind, we can see ahead. Amen?
Larry, I don't disagree, of course, with the 2.5 and so forth. I understand the way that's arrived at. But it bothers me that about Christ being cut off in the middle of the week, the middle of the 70th week. There's 2.5 years, now there's 4.5 years left.
No. The middle of the week is a Wednesday year.
Well, I understand it from that standpoint.
Yes.
But there's 7 days in the week.
Right. 7 days in the week.
And
And what would be the middle day?
well, it's Wednesday. I understand that reasoning.
Okay.
But in the sense of the 70th week,
Yes.
it's not right in the middle. It's the middle day, but it's not in the middle.
The 70th week of this day is right here.
Either I'm not coming through or I'm not getting
You're not coming through, Norm. Try again.
Well,
You want the 70th week to be in the middle of what?
I've got the same problem.
I want Christ to be crucified at the halfway point of that last week, and being crucified at the beginning of the Wednesday
Year?
year is not the halfway point.
Oh, okay. Let me speak to that for a second then. Thank you, Norm, for bringing that up.
I've had that problem ever since I first heard this.
You mean for 14 years you've had this problem?
Whenever it was.
Let's look at AD 30. And the year that I'm going to lay out will look like every other year in that 70th week. 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33. A year, the Passover occurs at Nisan 15. Always. And the Pentecost would occur 50 plus days, depending on where Passover falls, later. So Nisan 15, this would be month 3 for Pentecost. Month 7 is where we have the trumpets, Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, if you are insisting on crucifying Christ directly in the middle of 7 years, you're going to have a big problem. Here's year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, year 6, year 7. So if we're going to plot this in terms of days, see, you want to resolve it down to days, you're going to be in the middle of this year. And there is no Bible text on earth that will let you put Passover in the 6th month of the year. But when you're dealing, see, here's a problem. Let me explain this. This is a good question. In ancient times, any part of a day is a day. Because when you use only days to count things, you have to count that part. That's the smallest unit you're working with, is a day. When you're counting by years, any part of a year satisfies that year. So Jesus only needed to be crucified anywhere in that year to qualify for that year. You understand that? Otherwise, if you chart it out and plot it out, you're going to have to put Christ in the middle of the year. And what many scholars have done to make this happen is that they have said, the Jubilee calendar is a fall-to-fall calendar. And if we follow that, that puts the death of Christ in the spring of AD 31. And that perfectly lines up 3.5 and 3.5. But the problem with that is two things. A, the synchrony of God's calendar has never been fall to fall, and there is not one thing in the Bible dated from a fall to fall calendar. Not one. Not one of God's requirements are dated from a fall to fall calendar, number one. Number two, the alignment of the sun and the moon in AD 31 prevent that from being a possibility.
You see, I wanted to get him a year later, but I can see now that it wouldn't line up with the Passover thing.
It won't. It will not line up, and neither will the sun and the moon.
And it becomes a Thursday year instead of a Wednesday year.
That's right.
But it has been a problem in my mind.
Well, problem solved.
I'll think about it.
All right.
No,
All right.
I understand the reason.
Do you, I mean...
I do.
Larry, can you help us understand exactly what he's talking about? I don't understand.
All right. Let me restate it again. And see, I've got... Okay. Let me just shut up and do it. What Norm is asking is that here is the 70th week. Year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, year 6, year 7. Okay? And because the prophecy says that Messiah will be cut off in the midst of the week, middle of the week, what Norm wants to do, and many scholars, Norm, you're not alone on this, many people have done this, well-intentioned people, and I used to believe it until I got to working on this and found it wouldn't fit. But what we wanted to do was to put the death of Christ precisely in the middle of this whole 7-year period. All right? In order to get to the middle of this year, you got to have 6 months here and 6 months there. That would be the middle of the year. Now, because we know that Jesus is crucified in the spring of a year, so we would have to put spring right here. Right? That would mean the calendar, the year would have to begin in the fall.
Oh, I'm getting it now.
And this requires then a fall to fall calendar. Right? You understand that? This is why many scholars stop right here and say the Jubilee calendar is a fall to fall calendar. If you accept that, then you have the death of Christ in the spring, but then we run into some very crazy problems. For example, when is New Year's Day?
spring.
In the spring. Well, how can you be in the middle of the year and have New Year's Day? That won't work. Furthermore, the alignment of the sun and the moon will not work. The dating will not work, so that the actions of Jesus and the actions of the leaders of Israel and the 2 days between Jesus eating Passover and dying at Passover, that won't align either. In other words, the timing of this event is so involved with many things, it will only fit together one way.
We have to accept that the middle of the week prophecy
Is a middle year,
It's a middle year.
not a middle of the year.
It's not the exact middle of the year.
That's right. It's only the middle year. And see, this is why people get all messed up in their ideas about Jesus being crucified on Wednesday night. And he's got to be in the tomb 3 nights and 3 days, you know. It's a misunderstanding of how time is reckoned. Any part of a day qualifies as a day. Jesus is crucified on Friday, rests in the tomb, rests from his work of redemption on Sabbath, and comes from the tomb on Sunday. You have the 3 days and the 3 nights because of inclusive reckoning.
That's been no problem to me, but this
Yeah.
thing has.
Do you now understand this better?
I do. The light came on.
Praise the Lord. Yes. Okay. Yes. That will help. Let me show one more thing here. I'm expanding this. This is AD 27, 28, 29, 30. Jesus is baptized. I think it's my personal conviction that Jesus is born right around the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. And he's baptized at age 30 around the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. He's baptized in the fall of the year. So this gives Jesus approximately 6 months of ministry remaining in AD 27. This gives him 12 months in the year 28. This gives him 12 months in the year 29. And then he dies on the January 15 equivalent, Nisan 15. And he's on earth for 40 more days, so he's a total of 55 days on earth. And so you have about 2 months. So 12 and 12 is 24, 6 makes 30, and 2, 32 months. The total ministry of Christ. That make sense? Well, I know I'm out of time and I'm out of tape, but I've got to show you one last thing. And tonight I'll say more about it, but I really want to get you stirred up, if I can, so that you have something to think about. It's a shame when you leave this seminar and have nothing to think about. I have a little calendar here that's very fascinating. Interesting features of synchrony. What I've done with this calendar, and I'll be explaining this tomorrow a little more in the morning session, that when we start working with the prophetic time periods of Daniel and Revelation, looking at where are we in the grand week? How close are we to the finishing out the 6,000th year? So I got to looking at this and studying it, and this is what I have come to understand. I understand that when the millennium begins, the Sabbath millennium, it'll have to be in the spring of the year. Why do I say that? A year begins. Thank you, Annie. Very good. That lady has both noodles working this morning. When I say 1,000 years, what is the synchrony of the year? Spring. First new moon on or after spring equinox. God's year begins in the spring. 1,000 years? Spring. So I got to thinking, where in the future do we have a new day, a new week, a new month, a new year, and possibly a new millennium, all beginning on the same day? That would require a new moon. Yes or no? If you're going to use God's clock, and His clocks have shown to be pretty consistent, I think. Come to find out, in any given century, about 12 times in a given century, this alignment occurs. About 12 times, maybe 13 times. I could only get astronomical data for 130 years, so I really can't tell you how frequently this occurs, but I can tell you this, that in the century that we're in and have just finished, it happens 12 times. Let's take, just for example, April 6, 2008. Is the tape still rolling, Marty? What do we have? We'll finish this on tape. We've got to do it on tape because people will mail bombs to me for having explained this and not putting it on tape. So go ahead and stop the tape, and we'll see you in the morning meeting tomorrow with this. Now I'll tell you so you can think